Let me say, first of all, that happy to be here this evening. You fine folks in Pineville and those of you who are neighbors from Alexandria. Fortunate to see some of my old friends here that I haven't seen for quite a while. So it is indeed a pleasure to be in Pineville this evening. When my good friend Mike spoke to me about this several months ago, he said to me that the theme of this meeting is going to be from Pettus to today, basically. And I said to him, well, that's fine, but I'm not a political scientist, I'm a historian, and so it'd be difficult for me to talk about from Pettus to now without talking a little bit about the history that led up to what transpired on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that horrible day, that horrible Sunday in Selma, Alabama. So bear with me, if you will, as I plow through some of the history that most of you probably know anyway, but it makes me feel comfortable in being able to talk about the Voting Rights Act and the implications. So, for me, as a historian, March 7th, 1965 represents a point in American history which serves as a nexus between 100 years of constant struggle until today. So we have these people who are seeking the right to vote. Here in Louisiana, in one of the classes that I teach at Southern University is Louisiana history. So here in Louisiana, those people faced barbaric acts at the hands of political, civic, and religious leaders. Those acts included burnings, castrations, lynching, dismemberment, exclusions from communities, and any number of other horrible episodes along the way as they simply sought the right to register and vote. There is a period in Louisiana's history which we historians refer to as the redemptive period. I'll explain that for you. Prior to the Civil War, we were in the antebellum period. And of course the war, Reconstruction, but at the conclusion of Reconstruction in 1879, 1880, those people who had been in power politically in Louisiana during the antebellum period had somehow managed to find their way back into positions of power in Louisiana. And we refer to them, historians, as Bourbon Democrats. Well, my students ask me all the time, well, Doc, is that because they had this fetish for bourbon? And I said, well, perhaps they did, but that's not the reference. The reference is to the Bourbon dynasty in France prior to the French Revolution, and that family of kings somehow managed to restore their monarchy after the collapse of the French Revolution. So we make the comparison, if you will, as Louisiana historians, that is essentially what happened in Louisiana. Antebellum period, political power in the hands of the oligarchs, if you will. Those oligarchs returned to power after the period of Reconstruction was over. So, and you know, one would think that as this redemptive period was taking place in Louisiana, and Louisiana and the country is moving into the period, progressive people were going to be expecting good things to take place. Obviously, that is not what took place in Louisiana and most of the South. Because as we move through the redemptive and the progressive era, people once again face new restrictions on their ability to register and vote, because it's during that period, that progressive period and that redemptive period here in Louisiana between 1880 and the early decades of the 20th century, that we run smack into the face of Jim Crow. You will remember the first Governor Foster, who was, of course, responsible in Louisiana for things like the grandfather clause. It was during that period, 1892 to about 1900, when those things are beginning to show up in Louisiana. There are additional restrictions that these people are facing. And the reason for these additional restrictions was because of some things that had taken place in Louisiana between 1872 and 1880. In Louisiana in 1880, there were actually 21 to 23,000 more registered African American males in Louisiana than there were white males. The records bear that out. By the second decade of the Jim Crow era, that number had decreased so that there were less than 2,000 African American men registered to vote in Louisiana by 1930. That had gone down, if you will, from 180,000 to less than 2,000. So I don't need to go into detail about those events that were taking place then. You know, by then World War I was completed. We're in this interregnum. Somebody whose name I don't remember said World War I was the war to end all wars. My God, did it not take very long before we are in a second World War. Now, what do these things have to do with the Voting Rights Act? Well, they're connected to things that took place in the 1860s and the 1870s, because then we got the Civil Rights Amendments, and particularly the 15th Amendment. Ms. Freeman and I, my colleague, were talking about that on the way here, and she was asking me some questions about it. And I explained to her that perhaps the more important of the clauses in the 15th Amendment is the second clause, which empowers government to carry out the provisions of Section 1 in the 15th Amendment. Now, people say all the time, incorrectly, that the 15th Amendment guaranteed everybody the right to vote. It did not. Section 1 says you cannot be denied the right to vote based on certain characteristics. So it doesn't guarantee anything. It's Section 2 that's really important. And it's important because Lyndon Johnson used the language and the provisions in Section 2 in order to convince Congress to draft the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we got that clear. Now, we're at the war again. What is the connection? How does it connect to the Voting Rights Act? Well, African American veterans were returning to the United States after having been in Africa and in Europe, experiencing different conditions, coming back being confronted with the racism that they were confronted with when they left. After having been shot at, they were of the mind, we are not going to tolerate those kinds of things anymore. So they come back stressing equality, civil rights, education. They're talking to their children about improvements and how important education is and how important it is to participate in the political process. And then there's some other things happening. There's some of you here who are old enough to remember the Lee Street riot here or across the river in Alexandria and what that involved. Well, once again, you've got these military people who are concerned with the inequalities associated with being an African American in the United States of America. And then 1955 rolls around. One of the most horrible, brutal acts ever witnessed by mankind took place in Money, Mississippi. I believe it was Money. Emmett Till, 14-year-old from Chicago, murdered. What those murderers failed to realize was that they were actually martyring Emmett Till. People were becoming more and more restless. Among them were young people, men and women, who were about to take the stage for equality and civil rights. I'm proud to say that many of the young people from my institution stood up and said, we will not take that anymore. We are going to be afforded the same privileges that every other American citizen has enjoyed from the moment that they set foot on the face of this earth. Those students were willing to make every and any sacrifice. Attorney, good brother over there, can remember a case called Cox versus Louisiana, which went to the United States Supreme Court. It involved some university students who had demonstrated because some of their peers were incarcerated in jail in Baton Rouge simply for sitting down, protesting, and demonstrating. Changed the law in the United States. Cox versus Louisiana. Lombard versus Louisiana. Through the United States Supreme Court cases. Lombard involved Rudy Lombard, who at the time was a student at Xavier University. Dr. Norman Francis had to go down and get him out of jail demonstrating in New Orleans. Supreme Court case which changed the law regarding First Amendment right to speech and the ability to congregate. And you know that that was not the end. There was much pain, suffering, murders, bombings, physical attacks by law enforcement, ugly political leaders talking about secession from the United States, private schools cropping up everywhere, people being jailed for looking the wrong way, expulsions from communities. You can't live here because of the color of your skin. But what the oppressor failed to realize was that they were creating conditions and a stimulus for a new era of community organizations and civic groups set to take the fight for civil rights and equality to the national stage. You can only keep your foot, oppressor, on the necks of the oppressed for so long, they will rise up, as the Helots did in Sparta, and as other oppressed people around the world have always done. So where are we? Between 1961 and 1964, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had engaged in a voter registration campaign in Selma, the seat of Dallas County, Alabama. Selma, a small town with a record of consistent resistance to African American voting. Well, SNCC's efforts were frustrated by the stiff resistance from county law enforcement officials there in Dallas County. So somehow, the SNCC officials persuaded Dr. Martin Luther King to make Selma's intransigence to black voting a national concern. And so, Southern SCLC also hoped to use the momentum of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to convince the federal authorities that we needed a voting rights statute. So, during January and February of 1965, Dr. King, SCLC, led a series of demonstrations to the Dallas County Courthouse. Unfortunately, on February 17, 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by an Alabama state trooper. In response, a protest march from Selma to Montgomery was scheduled for March 7, 1965. You know the rest of that story. You know what happened to those 600 marches. On March 21st, 1965, the final successful march began with federal protection. And on August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It just did not happen, people, because LBJ was politically astute enough as a Southern congressman to convince his brethren in the House and the Senate that that was a worthy cause. LBJ assumed the presidency on November 22nd, 1963. You know what happened in Dallas. 1964, he was elected in a landslide. And he used that victory as a mandate to push for legislation that he thought would improve the American way of life. The primary aim of the Voting Rights Act was to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising the right to vote pursuant to the 15th Amendment. For some, the Voting Rights Act is considered to be among the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in the history of the United States of America. Here are some of the implications associated with the act. In 1965, there were only 6 African Americans in the United States House of Representatives. There were no senators. By 1971, there were 13 members, African Americans, in the House of Representatives, and 1 senator. Leap forward, 2015, there are 43 African Americans. In the U.S. House of Representatives, there are 2 members of the United States Senate who are African Americans. But it just didn't happen. Lyndon Baines Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress, and he outlined the many problems associated with African American and minorities not being able to vote. He said things to the Congress like this. They publicized the wrong date for people to register. They put the wrong address up where people were to go to register. Every form that an African American filled out was filled out wrong. No one passed the literacy test. It was difficult to remember every word of the United States Constitution when asked to say it. It was difficult, impossible for people to explain paragraphs of state law. Well, what did the Voting Rights Act do? Ban literacy tests, provided for oversight in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had registered to vote, and it authorized the U.S. Attorney to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. It did not eliminate poll taxes, but it authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate. And so the 24th Amendment grows out of this because it made poll taxes illegal in federal elections. So significant changes. And once again, I will tell you that this just did not happen. The Congress spent, not the Congress, the House of Representatives spent months debating the Voting Rights Act. In the Senate, and I don't know that anybody has been able to explain yet what transpired in the Senate, because the Voting Rights Act passed unanimously in the United States Senate. In the House, the vote was maybe 2/3 for and 1/3 against. We will at least credit President Johnson with convincing his former brethren in the Senate that it was a good thing to do. I am a firm believer as a historian that was timing. I am not sure that any president since Lyndon Baines Johnson would have been able to push that legislation through Congress. You are free to disagree with me, but his stature as a Southern politician, I believe, afforded him the ability to push that legislation through Congress. And he did it a couple of ways. He used theatrics. He used the momentum of Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge in order to embarrass members of Congress who eventually agreed. Now, you know, the United States Supreme Court has entered the fray recently. There are a couple of cases that come to mind. First one, lawyers thought was going to be the end of the Voting Rights Act. That was the Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District number 1 versus Holder, Texas case. And it was concerned with the constitutionality of the 2006 extension of the Voting Rights Act. And I was negligent in not reminding you that the original act was in place for 5 years, and for every 5 years had to be reintroduced and reauthorized by Congress, and that took place for an extended period. And then somewhere, I think in the 1980s, maybe 82, they extended it for 25 years. So then it comes up again in 2006, and this Texas case pops up as a result of that. The effect of it was that the court decided that the 2006 extension of the Voting Rights Act was constitutional. And they did not address the question of the continuation of the act. Now, that was not the end. And then the big case shows up. An Alabama case. Irony here. Shelby County versus Boulder. You're familiar with that one, I'm sure, because the court overturned Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act and essentially denuded Section 5. Section 4 contained the formula to be used in order to determine whether pre-clearance is necessary. The court destroyed the formula. That made Section 5 ineffective. So that's Shelby County versus Boulder. How ironic. An Alabama case comes to the front, which in many ways may set civil rights and voting back another 25 years. I told Professor Freeman today that as Americans, as Latinos, as Asians, as African Americans, and as women, we are once again in a redemptive period. Why do I say that? My earlier comments pointed out to you antebellum, Civil War, Reconstruction, redemption. The circle is closing. The Supreme Court is aiding closing of that circle. There are other cases out there looming to destroy the Voting Rights Act. Here's some of the comments that people have made as a result of the Shelby County case. President Obama, the court's ruling is a setback, but my administration will continue to do everything in its power to ensure a fair and equal voting process. Hispanic and Asian members of Congress slammed the Supreme Court for its choice to ignore reports that racial discrimination in voting still exists. The Alabama governor, the decision reflects how conditions have improved in Alabama and the South. The Shelby County attorney, Frank Ellis, the South is an altogether different place than it was in 1965. Jeffrey Toobin, CNN senior legal analyst, the Shelby County case has basically given a green light to 9 Southern and a handful of other jurisdictions to change the law any way they can and basically say to justice, catch me if you can. Those are just some of the comments as a result of the decision. So Angelina called me, and I'm going to sit down and Angelina called me a 3 or 4 days ago, and she said, Don, what's going on? Why is it that we cannot get our people out to vote? Why have things changed so? Is the Voting Rights Act still important? Well, of course it is. But there are a number of reasons why young, minority, and low-income citizens don't vote. And if you just bear with me for a minute, I just want to share some of this with you. It is from the Center for American Progress. It says that these are young people. 34% of non-voters are younger than 30 years old, and the vast majority, 70%, are younger than 50 years old. A full 43% of non-voters are Hispanic, African American, other racial and ethnic minorities. 46% have family incomes less than $30,000 per year, while only 19% of likely voters are from low-income families, while 72% of likely voters have completed at least some college. Most non-voters, 54%, did not attend college. In 2008, 57% of the voting age population cast ballots. That was the highest level in 4 decades. But of course, Barack Obama's first election. But 2 years later, only 36% voted in the midterm election. But for Obama's re-election in 2012, turnout went back up to 54%. For people, myself included, voting is an expression of hope, a belief that a citizen's input into the system will yield social dividends. Lacking hope, those voters don't show up at the polls because they believe nothing politicians say or do makes life better for them. In America, it's hard to be a good citizen if you're poor, ignored, or vilified. Life is just too hard to worry about lofty issues such as public policies and partisan political intrigue. Well-fed, middle-class, or affluent voters who have a justified belief that the political process works to their benefit, vote. That doesn't happen for poor people. The reason politicians ignore so many of the working poor is that they don't vote. And the reasons so many of the working poor don't vote is that certain politicians have made sure it's as inconvenient as possible for them to vote. The last election cycle saw several barriers to voting. Long waits, strict ID laws, the potential for increased use of provisional ballots among minorities. The Voting Rights Act is important. Now, if voting were easier and more egalitarian, politicians would suddenly have more citizens to answer to. Citizens who want different things and can't be ignored. Little wonder that these people don't vote. They've been rebuked, scorned, and ignored, absolutely. It's an unfortunate and rational reflex for those who have been excluded from the national conversation to avoid trying to elbow their way into a voting booth on election day. Well, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, where do we go from here? That's it.